I got very lucky recently and had an opportunity to try breeding Scarlet Badis. I say lucky because as common as Scarlet Badis have become in fish stores, the females are very difficult to find. I don't know if this is just because females aren't as attractive and might not sell very well, or if there's some effort to prevent them from being bred domestically. Either way, it took me about 6 months of scanning and searching every new Badis shipment at my local fish store before I finally found a female. When the fish are young, it can be somewhat hard to tell the difference. Before the males develop their distinct red coloration, they can look an awful lot like a female. And that can work to our advantage. No matter how hard they might try to prevent females being shipped to stores, when you can't tell the difference effectively, there's always the possibility that a female might slip through. So if you're patient and keep checking those tanks after new shipments come in, you might be able to find one for yourself. So that's where I want to start today. How to identify a female, and how to avoid bringing home a male that is either immature or subdominant, maybe suppressing its color. I think we're all familiar with what a mature male Badis looks like. Now let's take a look at a female. The difference should be immediately striking, at least in coloration. Instead of the vivid red color of a male, female Badis are some combination of white, silver, yellow, and even gray. You might notice some blue highlighting on the first ray of their ventral fins, and at times in the right light you might catch a blue sheen across the body. I noticed with mine that in the presence of a male, the female's breeding color seemed to be that she would turn on these faint gray vertical bars, similar to the red bars on the male Badis, but only gray, never red. Another thing you might notice looking at these females are some irregular and asymmetrical black or dark gray blotches on the body of the fish, and these just tend to develop as they mature. I don't know why. You can actually see them on males too, but underneath the red coloration it's not as visible. You can see it on this male if you look close. Now that you've seen a couple examples of two known females, I think it's going to be pretty easy for you to pick them out if you ever do stumble across them. To avoid accidentally bringing home a male that looks a lot like a female, I want to make it as simple as this. If you see any red vertical bars on the fish, it is a male. I wouldn't worry much about where you do or don't see any blue coloration, just avoid any red. In the females that I've seen, there is no red coloration whatsoever. So after I brought my females home and got them through quarantine, I was too excited to see what the fish would do when I put male and female together, so I set up this tank that you see here with a lot of rock work, some overturned small flower pots, just making a lot of hiding spaces in case there were any aggression issues. After waiting so long to find females, I didn't want to risk losing them to an over-anxious male. At first, the male's behavior was mostly curious. He would follow the females around, but didn't seem overly interested in breeding or chasing them away. He'd probably just never seen one before. After a couple of days, though, I noticed some aggression. The male was now chasing the females away, and now, after having bred them, I can tell you that was a sign that they actually had bred in that tank. At the time, I didn't know that for sure until I spotted a small fry, probably freshly hatched, clinging to the glass on the front of the tank. Once I knew I had breeders, I moved them into a different tank with a more deliberate setup. This was a small 3-gallon long tank that was designed for housing 3 bettas divided by glass panels that could be inserted or removed as needed. On the left side by the filter, I included some of the same rocks and flower pots for cover, and then on the right, I put a small anubias on driftwood. This was based on the assumption that whatever their breeding ritual is, they're probably attracted to plants. I think that's a safe assumption for many fish. At first, I just let the male establish territory around the anubias, and then a day later, I added the females on the other side of a now installed glass barrier, so that the females would have some time to adjust to the new tank and come down from the stress of being moved before being harassed by the male. The breeding behavior of Scarlet Badis is sometimes compared to that of bettas. This trick with placing male and female on opposite sides of a glass divider temporarily is actually a betta breeding trick that I heard from Gian Souza. It gave the male and females time to adjust and also get interested in breeding before actually being allowed to. For me, this had the added benefit of ensuring that I was there when they first had the opportunity to spawn, which was very helpful in trying to film it. I waited until I saw the male and at least one female struggling to get around the glass and get to each other. Then I pulled the divider. The glass divider trick worked like a charm, and as soon as I pulled it, they began spawning within seconds. I chose to use an anubias plant because I figured in addition to being an attractive spawning site, The way the leaves are oriented would also allow me to film the fish as they were actually engaging in the reproductive act. And that worked for me, but it also taught me something very interesting. I was able to watch over 10 or 15 minutes the female repeatedly position herself under the cover of the Anubias leaves, where she would wait for the male to come in and engage her in the embrace. This is one of the aspects that is similar to how bettas breed. And it makes sense to me that they would want to do this undercover. Wrapping around each other somewhat clumsily is kind of a compromising position, and I think doing so undercover helps them avoid predation. Getting to watch this live was just amazing, and there's one other interesting part I wanted to mention, and that is that their selection of spawning sites I don't think has anything to do with a plant. I think it was just the shape of the leaves that they found attractive, but I also saw them spawn under an overturned flower pot, under rock cover in the other tank, and even under a heater. I think the only thing they care about is being under something when they engage in the embrace. One of the things I was interested in finding out while watching them spawn was what happens to the eggs. Are they adhesive? Do they attach them to plants? Or do they just fall straight down from the fish and land on the substrate? I watched very closely while recording, and while it might not come through on camera, in a couple of occasions I was able to see a very small white object fall down from the fish after the embrace, which I assumed was an egg. So to me it looks like the eggs just fall down into the substrate. To test that, I trimmed down the wood that the Anubias plant was attached to and I placed it in a small deli cup, and then I let them spawn again. I checked the cup afterwards, and if you see here on the bottom, there are a few very, very tiny eggs. The closest thing I can compare these two in size is Danio eggs, but these are about half the size of any that I've seen. This is good news, though. This means that if you want to, you could have these fish spawn over an egg trap and then place those eggs somewhere else to hatch safely. In this instance, I just dumped the eggs back into the tank and then removed the parents. Before I move on, I want to mention the other similarity that Scarlet Badis seem to have to bettas, and that is that after breeding, the male will aggressively drive the female away from the spawning site. So you'll want to either remove her immediately afterwards, or at least make sure that there's enough cover in the tank that she can escape from the male, who will then stand guard over the spawning site for a few days until the eggs hatch. That does not imply, though, that there's any parental care. You really can't leave the adults in with the fry as they hatch because, being micropredators, the adults will immediately eat them if they find them. Within a few days, I spotted a newly hatched fry clinging to the glass in the back of the tank this time, and you can really get a sense now for how small they are when they're first born. At this point, I started adding some paramecium to the tank just to be ready for when the fry got hungry. But after a few more days of catching rare glimpses of tiny fry stuck to the glass somewhere, they disappeared. I kept adding paramecium to the tank for another week or so, but honestly, for a while I wasn't sure they were still alive. I was actually getting the tank set up to try spawning the adults again when I spotted them. They were still small, but clearly quite a bit more developed. Even after I stopped adding paramecium, I think the small microfauna that had been tracked into the tank on the Anubias plant and on the somewhat dirty filter that I had brought from another tank when I set this one up, had established themselves here and were doing a great job of keeping the fry fed in the meantime. After I found the fry again, I watched them for quite a while, and it made sense to me why I lost track of them. They really seemed to like to stay under cover, either around the filter, under the heater, or the plant, and they barely move. So now, judging by their size, I can tell they should be large enough to eat baby brine shrimp, and I did add some small amounts, but the reclusive and, let's just say, sedentary behavior of the fry made me a little worried that they might not eat most of the brine shrimp before they died, in which case they would just rot on the bottom and foul the water. So in addition to occasional feedings of the brine shrimp, I actually started adding some small Daphnia that I've been culturing lately. My thinking was they would be able to stay alive in the tank for much longer and give the fry a chance to stumble on them and eat them naturally and at their own pace without the risk to water quality. From that first spawn, it looks like I got 2 fry that survived at least to this point, and that's fine with me. They aren't worth enough to really produce in bulk and sell. I just wanted to watch the breeding process and see the fry grow. And over the next couple of months, I was able to. I kept up the feedings of small Daphnia and occasionally some baby brine shrimp, and they grew at a fairly quick pace. Recently, I reset that 3-gallon tank for another breeding project, and so I moved the fry out to a German breeding ring in the same tank where I housed the females. You can see now they have a fairly adult body shape, but they're not quite as large as an adult female, which I don't think I mentioned before is about half the size of an adult male. I think the females top out at about 5/8 of an inch. After a couple weeks of more feeding and growth time in the German breeding ring, I went ahead and released them into the tank, and they seem to be getting along fine with the females. At this point, I haven't seen any red coloration on either of the fry. I'm wondering to myself currently if I might have a couple more females, which I wouldn't mind at all. I don't really have any interest in mass producing these, like I said, but it would be cool to make some more females and then distribute them to some other fish keepers in my local area. As hard as the females are to find, I would love to make that easier for someone else by just handing them a female. In conclusion, I don't think Scarlet Badis are terribly difficult to breed if you're actually able to find a male and female. As you saw earlier, they are a good candidate for using an egg trap if that's how you want to do it, and otherwise the fry seem very capable to feed on naturally occurring microfauna in a mature tank setting, so these seem like also a good candidate to spawn in a mature planted tank and then pull the adults. I think the fry would grow up in that scenario just fine to a point. At some point you will have to start feeding them, so I think if you're a person who's comfortable with culturing live foods at home, this should be no problem. Raised in isolation, I could see paramecium followed by microworms or banana worms being very useful for getting the fry to the size where they can eat brine shrimp or something similar. And I think that'll do it for this one. If you're trying to do this yourself, I wish you the best of luck. I hope you can find a female. And as always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.